Évidemment, chers amis, 3 minutes pour vous remercier, hein, c'est du pas possible. Thank you, Mr. Editor Robert, and thank you all my favorite authors and coaches. And there are a lot of contributors hiding in the footnotes. Without this fierce time limit, there would be no end to the thank yous because each of these authors is part of a team. And you could say this book is a work of a mob. It's been really a privilege to be part of your teams. Some go back 20 years, several 40. And there are all these people backstage, our partners at home, archivists, professionals, les professionnels du siècle, c'est nos spécialistes du visuel et de la cartographie. And then there are all the students who were part of this research, who continually been part of our research. Students don't usually realize, at least at the beginning, how much they're teaching us and teaching each other. L'organisation était très discrète. Par exemple, le rôle du Musée canadien de l'histoire. It was a big surprise. I never imagined I would be somehow part of their Mercury collection. I've used it, I've enjoyed it. It's always, you know, down to earth and about making things and making places. Since I'm one of the people who's already read the book more than once, I can clue you to what really intrigues me is the connections between what seem like such different topics, different places. Il y a des renvois que vous allez découvrir entre les textes. What is it we have in common? So for one thing, all the authors, all the projects are really part of this momentum for teamwork and historical research. It used to be a lonely profession, but now historians, geographers, sociologists, archaeologists, we're all seeing ourselves as part of the humanities again, part of the digital humanities. In a generation, we've developed a host of new methods. Well, of course, they're computers, but I mean, I'm thinking about the sources, about the way we use our historical sources and the accessibility and the new questions that we're asking. It's a conversation across academic compartments, and we're beginning to recover some of the wholeness of the sciences humaines, which was almost lost for a century, in spite of the great interruption that's forcing us all to rethink everything. Thanks to the efforts of the last 10, 20, 30 years, there's some low-hanging fruits and there's some opportunities. We're more connected than we used to be. So, alors, il faut poursuivre la conversation. À toi.
Alors, on est rendu à la période des questions. Et ici, j'ai une question pour Sherry Olson. Quelle est la situation unique de Montréal par rapport aux autres villes américaines que vous avez étudiées plus tôt dans votre carrière?
Well, my first reaction when what happened to that? My first reaction was, well, it's 100 years more. It goes back farther. I mean, Montreal is one of the oldest cities on the continent. The second thing is the diversity, the linguistic diversity. Now, that has existed in some other North American cities and certainly in some European cities for a long time. There are lots of things, but it was interesting when I first came here from Baltimore. I thought, you know, you can tell the ages, the generations of housing. The architecture is different, but our row house is different. The widths are different. The shape is different. And yet, you know, there are all these clues. David Hanna was very interested in that. David was one of the students that taught Robert Lewis, who appears in the book, and then Robert taught Jason, and Jason taught Don, and you know, it's like there's several generations of students who have been still looking at this, the patterns. The segregation is so complicated, but that's the way it is in other cities.
I have another question on Boulevard Saint-Laurent for Sherry also. The Maine. The Maine played a role in Canadian history far beyond Montreal. Would you mind speaking a bit about that for our audience?
Well, it's crazy because Pierre knows more about this domain than I do, and Julie, who contributed to the book, knows more about the domain than I do. I just drink my coffee there. But, and I don't 100% agree with Robert that it is a division between East and West, but it's a very interesting place because it was diverse and heterogeneous from the beginning. Alan Stewart talked about that neighborhood as being the working class, mixed shopkeepers and so on. All of our main streets, like St. Mary, it's Notre Dame Street, and in the east and in the west, and Côte Saint-Antoine, some other streets, because of the way because they were where people met, they were diverse and they were built diverse. And then St. Lawrence is a good example. Generation after generation, it's a different diversity. This is the neighborhood into which the Jewish immigrants come in the 1890s, 1900s, and yet it continues today to be more diverse. The Chinese community comes into St. Lawrence, and people keep moving out of there into other neighborhoods. It's like there is this brassage that continues, and there's an upward mobility and an encounter that is associated with that diversity. It's one of the richest of a city in every sense.
I have a question about the spatial technologies which you use in your research, and whether technologies like GIS, and I'm quoting from the question, ever compels you to answer questions in a certain way that didn't happen with traditional geography or cartography.
That's tough. You know, one of our students, Kevin Henry, arrived to start his PhD, and he dragged us into GIS. I mean, David, Hannah, and I, and Rob had been making maps with colored pencils. And so when we switched from pencils and papers and tracing paper and so on to the computer, it was pretty strenuous, and we were using the mainframe, staying up till 2 in the morning because that's when the time was free. Now, in terms of what you can do, you can make statistics talk. And I think that when you study a system, as complicated as a city or neighborhood, I mean, it's true even about a body, or a human being, or an animal, but you're thinking systems. And to think systems, you have to think visually, because there's so many angles, there's so many things involved. So making the map out of the data, sort of creating a data space and then creating a map from the data space, it can be a little bit, it can fool you because it looks so precise. You know, some of these maps that flashed by, they look perfect. There's all sorts of errors and all sorts of uncertainties and ambiguities in there. And then there are choices about the extent and the inaccuracies and how do you represent that. So yeah, we can ask some new questions like, did people from different parts of Quebec who moved into Montreal, did they settle in certain parts of town? Yes, to some extent. And then in other ways, a lot of the immigrants from abroad, we see that they settled in places like Maine, and then from there they jumped out. There are neighborhoods like Griffintown. The people were arriving, the Irish arriving, and then they're leaving generation after every generation. They were leaving. So one of the things in the book that's interesting is Danielle and her gang analyzing Trois-Rivières. They're looking, using GIS also to say, what's the turnover? The people, which people stay, which people leave? It used to be that 20 years, 30 years ago, we were at a conference on immigration to Quebec, and we could only talk about the people who arrived. We couldn't say a word about the people who left. But the kinds of things that Danielle and this group, Claude and Mark, are working with, using GIS and using these data spaces, they can connect them in such, match things up in such a way that we can see something of who left and why did they leave and which ones stay, what kind of impact that has. For instance, the role of the property owners, which Robert talks about, more likely to stay around than the people who are tenants, but then the tenants can become property owners. To what extent do they move up or not? So those are kinds of things we tried.
Une dernière question avec une réponse courte. Est-ce que la pandémie, la situation actuelle, si elle se prolonge, va modifier profondément les relations sociales dans les villes canadiennes?
Il y a des centaines de personnes qui essaient de répondre, qui ont plus de bon sens que moi là-dessus. Pour ce qui nous concerne tout près, de tout près, il y a l'enseignement. Moi, je pense que nos départements d'histoire, c'est Peter Baskerville qui l'a mesuré, si vous voulez, sont vraiment en retard. Et ils n'ont pas les professionnels, ils n'ont pas les cours de méthode qui facilitent l'apprentissage du numérique et de la statistique, de quantitatif. Ben, tout ça, là, nous sommes forcés, avec cette pédagogie à distance, de nous moderniser. Et c'est une bonne chose. Et c'est ça, les low-hanging fruits là, dont je parlais. Tout ce qu'on a préparé, produit, là, il y a de belles sources en ligne. La BANQ a investi, le CIEC a investi, les fonds de recherche ont investi. Il y a beaucoup de possibilités et je pense que nous allons commencer à en profiter.
Merci beaucoup. Alors, c'est le moment de conclure. Je vais vous inviter à 2 événements qui auront lieu bientôt, qui sont disponibles sur le web. D'abord, le 28 octobre, les presses de l'Université d'Ottawa, de 19h à 20h, organisent un club de lecture qui s'intitule UO Bookin. Et l'ouvrage qui va être discuté, c'est l'ouvrage « Ce que je voudrais dire à mes enfants » de Maître Michel Bastache et Antoine Trépanier. Le lendemain, le 29 octobre, de 19h à 20h, ça devient UO Bookin, A Woman in Engineering, Memoirs of a Trailblazer, an Autobiography of Monique Fries. C'est une présentation, dans les 2 cas, du Bureau des diplômés de l'Université d'Ottawa. Pour terminer, vous allez voir apparaître la possibilité d'acheter l'ouvrage pour un rabais de 20% en utilisant un code qui va être à l'écran dans quelques instants, si ce n'est déjà fait. J'en profite pour remercier nos 4 participants et pour vous dire au revoir, à bientôt. Nous nous reverrons pour d'autres événements dans un avenir rapproché. Bonne journée. Merci beaucoup.
Merci tout le monde.